everyone. Welcome to this week's asynchronous course content. This week, we're going to do an introduction to IEP goals and objectives, and then we're going to begin talking about evidence-based practices. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about, again, IEP goals and objectives. What are they? Why are they important to us? Why are they important to our students? And what is the difference between the two? We're going to talk about writing IEP goals and objectives. IEP goals and objectives have 6 components, and you're going to practice writing each of those components of an IEP goal. Now, I do want to let you know before you ever get to that point that this week you're just going to put a little pinky toe in to writing the components of an IEP goal. It's okay if you are just trying and you're not sure if you're doing it correctly, because what we're going to do is in class, we're going to get together, we're going to talk about it. You're going to work with a peer looking at IEP goals, each of those components, and just having some discussions about it. And then later in the semester, when you become proficient at writing IEP goals, what we're going to do is we're going to come back, we're going to pick up what you wrote today, and then you're going to do an assessment of your early IEP component writing. And then you're going to see, are they fine as they are, or could you improve them in any way? Not only that, we're going to talk about evidence-based practices, and then you're going to have an opportunity to do some exploration online with evidence-based practices. You're going to get to pick an area of interest for yourself. For example, I love science, and then you're going to get to do some exploration of evidence-based practices related to that area of interest. All right, so we know that every explicit instruction lesson starts with an opening. Now, again, I am doing this online. If we were in person, this is an interactive portion of your lesson. This is not where you're just talking at your students, but because we're online, that's what I'm going to have to do. Now, there are going to be parts of it that I will do once we're in class and we are working synchronously. All right, so in our opening, we all know we're always going to start by getting our students' attention because there's no use in teaching if nobody's paying attention, and we are going to start with an attention getter. And I told you I'm going to be sharing with different attention getters with you throughout the semester, so there's a new one this week. Also, just a reminder that when you are teaching your attention getter, you're going to use the I do, we do, you do model. You are going to start with I do, and you are going to model your portion of the attention getter and the students. After you model it, you're going to move to the we do, that guided practice. What you're going to do during the guided practice is you and the students are going to work on or practice the attention getter together under your guidance and support. Then once you see your students have got it, you're going to move them into that independent practice where they are practicing and doing it independently. And it's not until that point that you bring it into your lesson. So let's go ahead and look at a new attention getter, and it would look like this. If you can hear my voice, clap one time. If you can hear my voice, touch your nose. If you can hear my voice, give a silent cheer. And so as students are doing these motions, you're able to scan, and once you know that you have everyone's focus and they are engaged and ready to learn, then you are going to share your learning objective for the lesson. And so I'm sure that you're interested in what are you going to be learning about this week? Well, by the end of this week, what I want you to be able to do is I want you to be able to describe like what an IEP goal and objective, or what IEP goals and objectives are, and what's the difference between the two. I also want you to be able to describe the 6 components of an IEP goal or objective just in very general terms. I also want you to be able to identify observable and non-observable behaviors and behaviors that are measurable. So why is that important to you? What is the relevance of this to you and your life? Well, as a teacher and in your practicum and student teaching experiences here at the university, you are going to write, you are going to teach, you are going to collect data on, and you're going to report on IEP goals and objectives. You will do this for every student throughout your career, whether it's here at the university or it is once you are a classroom teacher. And if you want to be an effective teacher, if you want your students to learn to have that change in behavior, you want to have really positive student outcomes, then you're going to use evidence-based practices because they have been shown through research to be effective. Now, the next part would be the review. And remember, the review is interactive, and I am not able to interact with you through a video. So we will do this when we are in person in our class. And so what we'll do is we'll review the syllabus, and then we're going to review the components of an explicit instruction lesson because we learned about those during our last class. All right, so what is the preview? The preview of today. What are you going to be doing today? Well, I already told you we're going to be learning about IEPs. You're going to learn about the six components of an IEP and IEP goal. And then what you're going to do is you're going to learn about one component, and then you're going to have the opportunity to write examples of that component. Always remembering that we are not counting right or wrong right now. We just want you to give it your best try. Not only that, you're going to get to learn about evidence-based practices, and then we're going to go online and we are going to do some exploring. You can do that on your own. You can do it with a peer. You can do it with a small group if you have the same interests. Now, when it comes to your IDEA goals, how does this lesson align with those? Well, we want you to gain a basic understanding of IEP goals and objectives and evidence-based practices. Again, super important information for your career and your current education. And as you are learning to write IEP goals, you're going to be learning about identifying and selecting evidence-based practices. So as you're doing those things, you are developing very specific skills and competencies that you need as a special education teacher. All right, let's start talking about IEP goals and objectives. So the first thing I want you to do, this is for your participation document. I want you to put it in a Word document. Remember, you're going to write the question on one line, and then you're going to write your response underneath. So for number one, you have two questions. What is an IEP goal, and what is the purpose of IEP goals and objectives for students with disabilities? Now, you might say, Todd, this is the first time I've heard about these. I have no idea. Just give it your best guess. I'm not marking it right or wrong. I'm working with you, and we're having you do this because we want you to activate your thinking. We want you to make those connections with prior knowledge, or we want you to put a good effort forth in sharing what you believe they are, and then you can check that understanding later. So go ahead and stop your video and then come back after you've responded. All right, welcome back. So what I'm going to do right now, first of all, I want to say I always look forward to that first question because that gives me an idea of what your prior knowledge was before you started this week's lessons. All right, so what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to give you a really super brief foundation on IEP goals because that's what we're going to be talking about. But I want to let you know that you will be taking a special ed policy and law class, and in that class, you're going to really dive deeply into this. So this is just to kind of give you an understanding of why do our students have IEP goals and objectives. All right, so back in 1975, a law was passed called Public Law or PL 94-142, and that is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And so prior to the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, this will be shocking to you. A student, for example, who used a wheelchair for mobility could show up at a school, not be able to access the school because there's stairs, and the school could say, we can't educate you. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine us turning a student away? Well, that's what it was like before PL 94-142 was passed. And so with that passage, students with disabilities, they called them handicap back in there, but students with disabilities had a right to an education. Now, notice I didn't say they had a right to a quality education. They had a right to an education. And whether or not that education was a quality education is questionable for many students with disabilities during that time. But then in 1990, a federal law was passed that ensured students with disabilities had a right to an appropriate education. It is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Now, you're going to want to know these acronyms and this terminology because this is terminology that you will use throughout your career, and you will be in a class and someone will say something about IDEA. They will not refer to it as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. All right, so not only did they have a right to an education, but with the passage of IDEA, they were guaranteed what is known as FAPE. So FAPE, we call that FAPE, and that is a free, appropriate, public education. So I want you to hear that again. Before they were just guaranteed an education, but with the passage of IDEA, they were guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. So not only were they guaranteed FAPE, but they were guaranteed FAPE in the least restrictive environment. And we call that the LRE. And we're going to talk about that more on the next slide. So again, IDEA guaranteed a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And when you think about the least restrictive environment, that is directly related to students' access to and participation with, inclusion with students, their peers, their grade level peers, same age peers who do not have disabilities. So they're non-disabled grade level peers. That's what we look at when we look at the least restrictive environment. So not only did it guarantee FAPE and LRE, but it also required students to have an IEP, an individualized education program, and that was for all students with disabilities who receive special education services. So that is the foundation of where IEP goals and objectives came from. So I talked about the least restrictive environment. And remember when I said the least restrictive environment is really related to inclusion and participation with their non-disabled peers. And we're looking really at that general education classroom and the amount of time they're with their non-disabled peers. So we're going to start on the left and we're going to look at the most restrictive environment. So the most restrictive environment would be a residential facility of some type, and that could be a juvenile detention center. Um, and these are for students who have really intensive needs. So we can imagine that a student with a disability who is in a residential placement has really intensive needs, as would a student who is receiving services through a homebound placement. Now, I don't want to confuse homebound with homeschool. They're two completely different things. Homebound services is when a special education teacher goes to the student's home and provides those services in their home. Very restrictive environment, as is a hospital placement. And a hospital placement could be a student is in the hospital because they've had surgery and they're going to be in the hospital for a month or two, or it could be a student who is in a hospital placement for even a longer amount of period of time. All right, most restrictive because they have zero access to their general education non-disabled peers in those placements. All right, let's move up. What's the next least restrictive environment? That would be a special education, a separate special education school. And that would be a school in which all students in the school had a disability. Now, that's pretty restrictive, right? If every student in the school has a disability, how much access, participation, and inclusion do you have with your same age, grade level, non-disabled peers? None. You don't have any. Some districts do have separate special education schools and some do not. I have taught in a separate school before. All right, now let's keep moving up. What's the next least restrictive environment? That'd be a special education classroom. And it would be a special education classroom in which the students spent most or the majority of their day. And that is where their specially designed instruction is delivered. But the thing is, again, you're in a separate classroom. You're not in the general education classroom. Students are not with their non-disabled peers, and that is for the majority of the day. Does not mean that they are not going or having that inclusion and participation with non-disabled peers. It just means the majority of the day they are in the separate classroom. All right, keep it moving up. The next one would be a resource room or pull-out services. Again, that is in a separate setting, but it is for a smaller part of their day typically. But that is again where they are receiving that specially designed instruction. And finally, the least restrictive environment of all in general, just in general terms, would be students receiving instruction in the general education classroom 100% of the day, but you're providing them with the supports they need to be successful in that setting, in that curriculum, and with their non-disabled peers. But again, I want you to remember that the least restrictive environment is based on the student's needs. And so there may be a student for whom a residential placement is the least restrictive environment. There may be a student for whom a special education classroom is the least restrictive environment for reading, for example. So individually based, and the general education classroom is not always the least restrictive environment because it has to be appropriate. All right, let's do a quick check-in. How do you feel so far about the foundation of IEP goals and objectives? Hopefully everybody is somewhere around here, but if you are right here, please reach out to me. Always, always, always happy to meet with you. And as I said last week, the very last thing I want to see on your participation submission is questions, and then underneath list any questions that you have about this week's content so that when we're doing the review, that's where my review comes in and that interactive part. We will do it in class in person. All right, I'll see you in the next video, everyone.